there continues to be this notion that about 50% of B2B salespeople are not hitting quota.
Hello, Sales Nation. I'm Will Barron, host of the Salesman Podcast, the world's biggest B2B sales show where we help you not just hit your sales targets, but really thrive in sales. If you haven't already, make sure you click subscribe. And with that, let's meet today's guest.
Hi, my name is Tibor Shanto. I'm with Renbor Sales Solutions in Toronto, Canada. I work with B2B sales organizations and individuals, helping them translate their strategy into execution through tactics.
In this episode with Tibor, we're diving into whether there are just literally too many salespeople in the marketplace right now, whether it's oversaturated, overcrowded, and how you can become resilient in your sales role over the next 5 or 10 years so you can survive the next economic collapse, which is coming our way essentially any moment now, which is really going to shake up the sales industry forever. And with that said, let's jump right into the show. Are there too many B2B sales professionals in the marketplace right now? Is the marketplace, for what we do, oversaturated?
I think yes, but different than a lot of the discussions that have been going on. So let me position, when you and I were corresponding about what we might talk about, I just finished being on a panel where, again, due to alphabetical order, I always get to go last, which means some of the better ideas are taken by the time they get to me. And the question that was posed was, assuming you're giving advice to a VP of sales, 20% of his people are confident about how they're going to make their numbers, and it's Q4, the start of Q4, where we are today. 30% have some sense or are hopeful, that they could make it, and 50% haven't got a clue. And the question was, what advice do you give this VP of sales? And so again, as I say, the other two fellows jumped on the obvious answers, so I had nothing left. So I said, well, my first advice to him, because I'm imagining that his concern is ongoing as opposed to immediate and limited to the Q4 of this year, is to fire the 50% that don't have a clue. Now, this wasn't the same discussion that's been going on in the sales industry about, are there too many salespeople and so forth. My answer to that is, again, yes, but different reasons. The question here was really, what do you do with a non-performing asset? And, a salesperson is an asset to the company, to the organization, certainly to that individual. So what I found interesting is when I said, because let's face it, if you were a chicken farmer and 5 chickens weren't doing it, they'd be in a bucket of KFC within a week, right? There'd be no thought, no nothing. If this were a copier, if this were a truck driver, if this were anything else other than a salesperson, if you had a 50% non-performance rate, you would do something about it like yesterday, right? Maybe not yesterday, it was a holiday, but you know what I mean. So the response from the moderator was interesting. And I don't think that, sort of the typical one, which is, well, what would that say about the VP of sales, having to admit that 50% of the things that he did were wrong? So if we look at it from an American perspective, any baseball team would give their eye teeth for a 500 batter, right? So 500 is not that bad, right? But I pointed out that there's a difference between a VP of sales and a leader, right? A leader understands where they made a mistake and they act on it, right? Because they know that in order to lead, they have to demonstrate a certain set of attributes if they expect people to follow them, whether they're going into battle or into sales, right? Whereas if you don't do anything about it and pretend that everything is sunny and that the emperor is fully clothed, what are your salespeople seeing? They're seeing a moron who doesn't do anything about something that's obvious. Would you follow that guy into battle? No. So that was the context of my question. It wasn't the usual sort of where are we with social selling and all that crap. It was more like, are VP of sales true corporate leaders, or are they just rah-rah boys for a bunch of overpaid rah-rah kids? That was the nature of the question.
We'll come back to that in a second, Tibor. There's something that crops to mind here, and for all the B2B sales professionals listening, they will be perhaps pondering this as well. I have no idea, because there's clearly laws, there's regulation, there's contracts and other things that tie into this. How easy is it? You can talk about Canada, you can talk about the US perhaps, but how easy is it for a VP of sales to sack someone or sack half of their team just like that?
I think easier than they think, of all professions, right? Because again, if you measured things, and as you say, if there was an agreement, a contract, whatever degree of agreement there was between the company and the salesperson. So I'm not a lawyer, so please don't rush out this morning and act on my advice. Check with your lawyer. But I would suspect that if I could document that somebody's been underperforming consistently for a period of time, And I have done everything from a training, hand-holding, technology, and babysitting point of view. And this person has still chosen not to change the way that they approach their craft, if not profession. I suspect that I could fire that person relatively straightforward. I'm not saying that, come in here, you're gone, but I could put together a pretty easy case that most corporate lawyers would feel comfortable with. We're talking about 50% of non-performers. You take a look at the stats that are out there, and I know stats are easy to manipulate, and but there continues to be this notion that about 50% of B2B salespeople are not hitting quota. Nobody would like think twice of you getting rid of a copier that was not delivering half of what it was supposed to be delivering in the brochure.
And it,
Yeah.
it, it seems as simple as that. And the reason I asked that question is
I'm
that,
not saying it's simple, but I think the hard part is the part between our ears, not the legal part.
sure,
The hard part's making the decision to do it. Once you decide to do it, as with most things, how to do it all of a sudden present themselves because now you're looking for them.
because the reason I ask is my last sales role, I always hit my target just about, but they for sure wanted to. I didn't fit in with the company culture for numerous reasons, and I wasn't a good fit there. And they knew that I was starting projects and side hustles and businesses on the side because they knew that I wanted to be an entrepreneur because I told them that fact. So they knew that either they wanted to shift me on as quick as possible or they wanted to literally shift me on by sacking me. But I kept it my target. And so they were having really awkward conversations with themselves internally in the fact that I wasn't really a team player. I didn't really focus on any of the internal paperwork, for example, which at a medical device company is important because some of it is regulatory. I think that's a word. I might have made that word up.
That's
Um,
okay.
but I got the impression that they were trying to. I think they used the term in the exit interview when we all got on well because we knew that it was coming to an end. They wanted to manage me out of the position. Now, for someone who is in a sales role, who's perhaps in that scenario, and perhaps they're in it for a finite amount of time, like I was. I knew I was going to leave that company. I was just trying to close as many deals as I possibly could to build up a good beachhead of cash so I could start this business. For people for people who are listening to this who that relates to, is it then appropriate for them to feel safe and resilient in their sales role if they're still hitting target, or can people be let go for other reasons, if that makes sense? Or is hitting your target the only goal that, what I'm getting at is hitting your sales target the only goal that we need to have as a B2B sales professional, or do we need to tie in the rest of it as well?
I think we need to tie in the rest of it, but I think it's a pretty good gateway, triage. I had this discussion with somebody before we called these things podcasts back in the early part of the last decade. But, I think that if you have somebody that is making their numbers, and let's not say how much they're beating that quota by, but at the same time is disruptive. They're not following the process. They're constantly questioning the methodology and things along those lines. And they themselves maybe have their own process, or maybe they're one of those people who has got some abilities that they've been able to tap into and so on. So they're constantly making their numbers, but in every other element, they're disrupting the ability of the manager to develop other people and so on. They're not following the process. It's really difficult for a manager to have a successful salesperson by the numbers not follow the process because it's hard to convince the others that they need to do something. Now, if all of them were selling savants, great, but the reality is generally you get one selling savant and the rest, are mere mortals who have to be developed. And if you have somebody that's not following the process, even though they're beating the numbers, you have to look at the big picture. And if I can get everybody to follow the process and increase my total revenue as a team, it may be worth the sacrifice. I lamented then the same thing that I lament now, is that in most other professions, I could probably trade that person. If they were, Liverpool, and, I could probably trade them to Manchester if we felt that the chemistry was there, because the skills are there. It's just generally they don't fit with the fabric of the company. But I always use the example, it may not make sense in the UK, but in the States, of Phil Jackson, that you had to play his triangle offense or you didn't play for him. But when you played that, it clearly made a difference. So I think bringing it back to sales, I do believe that at times you have to make the sacrifice and let go of somebody that, even though they're making their numbers, they're causing too many other difficulties and inability for the manager to develop the other salespeople.
So I want to come back to being resilient in a second, but just to wrap up this initial question of are there too many salespeople in the profession? Would it make economic sense then for most organizations, if we play totally by the numbers here, if most salespeople are not hitting their sales target, still clear they're bringing in some revenue, but if we chopped off the bottom 20% of those individuals, took those 20% out of the market whatsoever, give that 20% of extra territory to the top performers, well, we're saving on wages, admin costs, management time and effort. We have a more focused sales team. More of them are high performers as a percentage. Could we drop in this B2B sales space 20% of the low performers and actually see perhaps an increase in revenues across the board of all these organizations?
I think you could. You may not see an instant increase in revenues, but certainly you see an increase in margins. I would argue over time you'll probably see both, but in the immediate sense, like the next day, you'll see an increase in margins. You'll see a greater focus, which I think will lead to revenue. Because let's face it, if you've got 50% who are non-performance, that means 50% of your sales enablement, 50% of your ask, 50% of anything that goes into success is being squandered. So if you can recapture some of that and apply it to people who know how to make most of it, then not only are you saving, but by applying it where it works, you're compounding the benefit. So I think there's definitely savings. And, everybody in sales, I know it's a cliche, but, cliches come back to bite us. And we always talk about the 80-20, 80-20. 80% of your reps are going to make you, 20% of your reps are going to make you 80% of your revenue. Well, why are you hanging on to that 80% that's just sitting there stinking up the corner? I mean, I know there's reasons, but nobody dares ask the obvious question is that, if 50% are not making revenue, isn't it time to consider a change? And, do that logically, do that with a severe sense of human appreciation. Again, I'm not suggesting, we toss people out, but once you've done everything to help somebody, and they're not willing to help themselves. And let's face it, the other sort of thing that's not talked about is generally sales is the back door into a corporation, right? I know it's getting better, and I have to give the industry credit, especially over the last few years, they've done much better. On the other hand, they still go out and do these, what I think of as these wide net casting, from these college classes where they'll go and, scoop up like 30 reps, and they know that in a year they'll have 5, right? So, I think there's a whole bunch of benefits that could happen if we went on a diet.
Perfect. So, with that in mind, are the people who are struggling typically, because I want to get practical for the individual B2B sales rep now, because this has been quite high level so far, are the people who are struggling, is it and the answer might be everything, I'm going to say, but is it typically or more typically the fact that they don't have a skill set of a process and strategy of how to sell? Or is it that they're not putting in the effort? Is it that they're just not suited to sales? How do we start to, for the individual listening to this who's going, well, I'm not doing so great. That's why I'm listening to this podcast. I want to improve, but I'm not getting the support at work in the job. What are the typical things, high level or most impactful things that they can do to perhaps jump themselves out of that 20% that probably don't need to be there, that could get sacked at any moment, into the resilient percentage that are a good bet and a good investment for the company they're working for?
So I think, one of the things that they could do is they could get curious. And I know what I'm going to say is going to sound a bit odd, but I can expand on it. I think that they need to get their ego out of it. I mean, when you learn anything, by definition, you're learning it because you don't know it as well as the person you're learning it from. Doesn't matter if it's painting, crochet, or selling, right? So I think that if you learn the fundamentals and you began to develop those fundamentals, then you can improve your game incrementally. I think, unfortunately, salespeople are put into a situation where life is 3 months, right? Every quarter, there's a different set of pressures and so on. So I think that if they adopted a discipline, so one of the reasons there were a lot of sales organizations for a while were hiring athletes who were almost professional grade but didn't get drafted into the pro leagues because they knew that they were driven and they were coachable. So they were, they would be able to be disciplined and brought around to the system and so on. So I think that if you're willing to do that, then yes, there are things that individual salespeople could do. I think again, salespeople are just people, so contrary to rumor. So there are things that we could do that are just at first it's hard, but it's human nature. So again, if we go back to this 80-20 premise, who's in the office most days? Well, it's the 80% that are not cutting it, right? Because they're trying to pretend, waiting for that secret inbound call that's going to come, from that magic prospect. What is this? Some pundits call it the dream customer, the dream client. Well, the word dream is in there for a reason. It's not the one customer or executed customer, it's the dream. So get out of bed, stop dreaming, and go out there. So who do they hang out with? They hang out with the guys in the office, and they're in the office because they're not making their numbers. So they should get out of the office, find the guy that everybody talks about who's never there, that's usually at the top of the leaderboard, and see if they can hang out with that guy. And by virtue of doing that, approaching that person and asking them to do that, they'll get over a lot of the nervous tension that comes over approaching a customer and asking them to do something with them as well. So I think, yes, they can be put on a very specific plan and with a good manager who understands that they're a coach. I think you can take somebody that's almost adequate and make them more than adequate.
Perfect. So that is systematizing, being curious, and the ego element of this. You might enjoy this. So I launched a product called the Sales School. I won't kind of bang on about it here in the podcast. Anyone who wants to know
Go
about
ahead.
it, anyone who wants to know about it will have heard about it in our emails and stuff by now. But interestingly, on the ego front, there's a whole bunch of different courses, and it's different to the usual sales training in that I'm covering things like how to become more charismatic, personal brand, things like this. So it
I
sits
want that.
alongside traditional sales training, and that's our spin on it. It's self-development for salespeople. But one big sodden thing that took me months to put together was, we called it, and I've removed it now, and I'll explain why in a second, because we need to rebrand it, but we called it the Selling Boot Camp. And it was a 6-week workshop with a ton of content, almost as much content as in the rest of the sales school, that takes people from not knowing anything about sales to really essentially everything I know about the process and the systems and all that good stuff and the motivation elements of it. It all went into this extra bonus section. But when we did A/B testing on a landing page, so it'd be either people would click through in an email, or they'd click through on an advertisement on Facebook, on YouTube. And there was the 2 pages. One just had all the cool charisma stuff and all that kind of self-development work. And the other one had all that, plus this bonus of a boot camp to take you from beginner to kind of intermediate to selling skills and selling knowledge. The one without the boot camp did far better and converted far higher. So that tells me that either our audience are incredible salespeople and they're going, hell, I don't need that. I'm earning 4 million quid a year in this B2B SaaS company. I'm crushing it. That's just a waste of my time. How dare you put that in front of me? You're insulting my intelligence, my sales skills. Or exactly what you said, Tibor. People have an issue perhaps with their ego, and they don't want to admit to themselves that brushing up on the fundamentals and the basics might be helpful for them. And so that just came to mind as you were mentioning ego then, because I don't think we really talked about ego too much on the show, but I guess it goes hand in hand with
That's
being
because
curious.
neither of us have one. That's because neither of us have one.
Maybe that ours are both so big that we just ignore it, but or we assume make assumptions when we shouldn't. But yeah, I thought that goes hand in hand with being curious, right? Of to be curious, you've got to reduce your ego so that you're open-minded to little things that can perhaps have a big impact. That you only need a few more of those 20% of things that give 80% of the results, right? And that could be the difference between doing okay and then really doing well.
Yeah, I think ego is a big part of it, but it's, again, unfortunately, some natural born salespeople or salespeople who generally do well tend to have egos that others see as being sort of overly done. So we're not talking on that level. I think we're talking on just being able to let go for a few minutes and be curious about what we don't know. And this is why I keep saying to salespeople that if they go in there thinking that they know what the customer wants and needs and so on, they're going to drive the conversation to that direction. So if we take ego out of it and say, I don't know, and if I don't know, I need to ask questions. Now it's a question of what I asked, badly phrased. Now it comes down to what questions I ask. It becomes a different process, and it is driven by curiosity. And the discipline I find among good salespeople is that there comes a point where they do know it, so it becomes how do I keep this curious now because I've seen it before? And they just bring it down to smaller curiosities. It's almost like the golf player going back to the same golf course, weekend after weekend. They know the course intimately. The game really becomes about themselves and how they play it. And I think it's the same with curiosity and sales and ego. The more curious you are, the easier it is to put aside the ego. The more you learn, the easier it is to become curious because you made money being last time curious.
Coming back to this initial question of are there too many sales professionals? Do you feel like over the next 10, let's go shorter than that, like 2 to 5 years, that there are going to be a reduction in the number of sales jobs out there? Seemingly, it makes sense in that there's going to be more automation, marketing are taking over some of the things that salespeople have done in the past. Information is everywhere. Salespeople aren't the gatekeeper for that anymore. Is there is there going to be a push to, because salespeople are expensive to run, right? Especially like me, field salespeople, when you give them a brand new BMW every couple of years to rag around on and not look after. Are there going to be less sales professionals or less sales professional positions in 2 to 5 years from now? Like very, very literally, there's just going to be less people getting hired.
So I'm going to play a word game. Hopefully, people get the humor. I don't think there'll be less sales professional, but there'll be less salespeople. So the people who are truly professionals these days, I think they'll survive. I think the people who have sales on their cards who are not professional, at peril. And again, it's not a negative. I mean, it only makes sense that certain things automation is going to help with, right? So it's not a question of replacing, it's just doing it better than we do, right? But there are going to be elements of the sale and of certain sales, especially what people like to call, I never understood the term complex sale. I think the only thing that makes it complex is the way that we do it. But, it just has a lot of moving parts, but most things in life do, right? So I think those people where you need to understand, where part of the job is helping the customer see the dots and then connect the dots in a way that makes sense. So I think those salespeople, the ones we read about who have success in current environments, whether it's technology or otherwise, I think they're going to stick around. I think the ones that are in peril, and again, it's not their fault, and I'm not making a value judgment, but there are a lot of functions. I mean, look, right now, McDonald's, you can go and self order. You weren't able to do that before. The implication of that is more convenience for me, less people being employed at McDonald's. Now, hopefully, those people will find jobs in other, skillful things or what have you. I realize there's human beings involved, not minimizing it, but the reality is a lot of things that quote unquote people working in a sales organization who from the labor board or whatever government statistician is considered a salesperson, those people are going to be gone. What's going to be left are people who are able to conduct a conversation with somebody, uncover something that even that person wasn't, you know, defining that way, and then driving the deal. So I can't see but the population of people who are classified in sales is dropping, but I don't think the professional element will be reduced because people are still going to have to make economical decisions that require input beyond their own.
So I was on a panel recently down in London, and I got asked a similar question to the one I just posed to you, and I give a very similar answer back. So I'm glad I'm not totally ridiculous in my thoughts and opinions on this. And the question essentially was it was a marketing event, and the question that I got asked was, "Are you going to be so?" And it was kind of teeing me up to kick off about it. Essentially was, are you sorry that you've named the show the Salesman Podcast when us marketers are going to take all your sales positions, automate it, and there's only going to be four of you left in the whole of the industry by kind of 2025? And my response was similar to what you kind of outlined then, Tibor, of I don't do any content for people selling used cars. I don't do content for people who can pick up a phone and close people on one call. All the content we do is for, you might be able to give me a better phrase because I don't like the term the complex sale either, because, yeah, if we perhaps make it more complex than what it needs to be, as you said. But my response was, well, all the content that I do is for the complex sale. It is for high value B2B transactions that essentially need project management as opposed to some pesky salesperson cold calling and pestering the heck out of someone to close a 5,000 a month deal. Because my background is, high value deals to essentially the government rather than a business here in the UK selling to the NHS. So with that, what skill sets do we need to be picking up now to become resilient over the next 5-10 years as this takes place as we see our colleagues drop off the mark, as we see hopefully salespeople get elevated from just pesky people cold calling to and I'm picking on cold callings more heavily than I need to be here. My biggest bugbear at the
Yeah.
moment is people
Don't
doing.
remember who's on the line with me.
And my biggest bugbear at the moment is people spamming out cold emails and trying to be a marketer. So perhaps that's a better example, sending out 500 emails a day and just burning your personal brand with all these potential people that you can connect with in the future. But you mentioned being great at building conversations, being able to uncover the dots and be able to guide people and essentially build a bridge from where people are to where they want to be, and then driving the deal forward. What skill sets do we need, or what resources do we need to dive into? What do we need to learn right now so that we can smash it in not just this target, this quarter, but 5 to 10 years from now?
That's an entirely whole show. We could do that. No, because I've been influenced by stuff that I'm reading outside of sales, and I think most people should get out of sales several times a day and just realize there's a whole other world out there. And what you'll find is that it stimulates a whole bunch of things that you can apply to sales. So, people always ask me what sales book they should buy or what they should read in order to become better salespeople. And they're always surprised that I don't recommend the one that I wrote, but I recommend the 10-day MBA. Because ultimately, as salespeople, we're involved in helping people make decisions, right? So we get all emotionally involved in our widgets and our services and our sales training and all that crap. But I don't think the customer thinks of it like that. They're trying to achieve something and they're making a decision in the process of trying to achieve that. So I think that the skills that people need to survive into the future and to become better salespeople in the future really have to do with understanding how people make decisions, why they make decisions, why they do certain things in the process of making a decision, and whether that decision is related to sales or whether it's related to a cup of tea. Because the process from the individual perspective, and I write about that in my blog today, which won't be the day that this podcast will appear, so they'll have to go back and figure it out and read all my blog posts and see which one I'm talking about. But, I talk about a quick incident. I read this social media post on the weekend where somebody in our business, I think from the marketing side, but in the business of being a pundit, was talking about how she was so flattered because she was just carded at a liquor store and she's about to turn 40. And the fact that she was carded, and you can just see the whole shit coming out of it, right? Like, so this, can you imagine this person in sales? Because they never bothered finding out why they were carded, right? They just assumed right away that it was the glowing nature of their chin and it was their lovely looks, right? So I relate a scenario. I was in O'Hara Airport about 10 years ago. I just finished a gig. It was a hard gig, and I was ready for a beer. I was ready for two. But, I ordered a beer, and they carded me. And I said, what the fuck? I mean, I'm 50 years old, I have all the markers, like, there's no way you can confuse me, right? So they wouldn't tell me. They just said if I want a beer, So I sacrificed. I waited till I got on board. And the years later, I went back to O'Hara. And again, I got carded. And again, I said, what the hell, right? So I found out that what had happened is there were two lawyers who had a beer. One was apparently younger than the other. The younger one got carded. The older one didn't. Then the younger one sued, right? Being the litigious society that they are, they sued, right? So what's the solution for the airport? They card everybody. You're 90 years old coming through on a heart-lung machine, they'll card you, right? So, had nothing to do with their youthful good looks. The store was covering its legal ass. But it's a question of how you look at the scenario and what questions you ask that's going to drive success in sales. So in answer to your question, I think the ability to leave sales behind and think about what goes into a decision, what goes into a person when they decide to buy a Toyota instead of a Honda, things like that. So some of the reading that I've been doing has nothing to do with sales and has more to do with the way that we think and how we function and some of the misconceptions that exist in sales that have been eradicated with some of the science that's been coming out over the last, 15, 20 years. So I would say if you get out of sales and try to understand how people think, why they make decisions. I was talking to this VP from a bank that had nothing to do with sales. They were a former customer. And he said that every decision he made, had the question in there, is this going to get me fired? which I thought was interesting because he was, clearly top of his game and all that. But that got me thinking, and how many other people that we're sitting with, who look really macho in a suit and all that, are sitting there going, shit, is this going to get me fired? So maybe I got to tear my conversation to helping this guy understand that he's not going to get fired, which has nothing to do with my product.
Couple of things here. We'll come on to useful things in a second. I assume when you say carded, you mean you asked for ID so they can check your age.
Yes,
Because the
yes,
last
yeah.
time I was asked for ID was in Chicago, outside a bar. I didn't have my driving license with me. I just had a debit card and credit card, and I didn't get in. And I was 27 or something. And the guy, and my little brother got in, who was just turned 21. In the UK, it's 18 to get into bars and to drink. Obviously in Chicago, US, I assume it's the whole of the US, it's 21. So he got little shit got in there and I didn't. So I had to walk back to the hotel and sort all this nonsense out. But yeah, anecdotally, Chicago,
Yeah.
for whatever reason, are strict
They
on
won't
this.
let you drink.
It's probably a good thing. It's probably a good thing, all things considered. Okay, so if we are going to elevate ourselves into genuinely solving people's problems. There might be a better word to describe this because it's quite cliche at this point of becoming a consultant for an organization. And then hopefully there's a product that aligns with that on the back end of things. But we're going to have multiple conversations. We're going to build a brand within the account. We're going to do all this good stuff before we close these big enterprise sales. Does the term salesperson need to change? Or do you think it can adapt and evolve and be dragged along with us? Because I've always been a salesperson. I've never had a job title that had sales within the job title. I was a territory manager, account manager, senior account executive. Clearly, they all mean professional salesperson. No one's getting bullshitted one way or the other with this. Do you think that we can drag sales away from the used car salesperson persona and stereotype? Or is there going to become a point where we dump all these people on the bottom end of it who aren't adding value, who are trying to close people on one call, that aren't closing huge sales? And I hope for the audience kind of get, if they're in that position, they get dragged along with me in the podcast and they are closing these big deals, these enterprise deals. They're in B2B, they're in it for a career as opposed to a 1 or 2 year stint after college. Is it possible for us to drag sales up into the realm of business consultant and roles of that nature, the C-suite, or do we need to drop it and start over again?
No, I think it can be done. I think it's being done daily. I think that, if you spoke to customers across, you know, various industries, and let's stick to B2B, but across the B2B realm, I think they will point to salespeople who have truly contributed to their business, right? Not by discounting the product by a certain amount, but really bringing those ideas through the course of conversation, helping the customer maybe fine tune their objectives, and maybe as a result of that, finding a clearer path or alternative path or whatever the case. So I think I don't shy away from the term salesperson. I think done right, we are contributors, to capitalism and to good things, right? There's a lot of things that people benefit from daily that happened as a result of sales. I was asked by somebody in a sort of nasty way. I knew I was being set up as to what sales does. And I remembered this great video. I forget the guys, but I'll send you the link offline afterwards. To talk about how, in the 60s, it was the advertising guys, and then the 80s, 90s, it was the financiers, whether it was initially the takeover, then the IPO, and now it's a software engineer. But none of that matters unless the salesperson goes out and sells it. How many .coms died on the vine because somebody forgot to sell it? And with all due deference and respect to Microsoft, how many times did they survive because they just sold it as opposed to over engineering it? And again, I say that in the most positive and respectful way. So I think I wouldn't shy away from sales, but I mean, again, there are footballers who don't deserve to be on the pitch, but they needed a body out there, right?
Well, when you put it like that, and there's one final thing that I want to wrap on, but I genuinely believe this, and I don't know what data evidence that there is or will be to support it, but software engineers is the cool job right now because of Mark Zuckerberg. Entrepreneurship is cool right now because of people like Gary Vaynerchuk and the founders of Instagram, again, Mark Zuckerberg, and all these people who have gone from nothing to billions of dollars. They're total unicorns. It's very unlikely, almost indefinitely unlikely, anyone in this audience, myself, and I hope you don't mind me saying this, but yourself included, Tibor, we're going to go from nothing to multiple and billions over the next kind of 2-3 years. I'd love to promote the show as something that could help you with that, but it's unlikely that to happen. So I feel like, and everyone, all these groups have their little time, but I feel with the next economic collapse, which we're overdue, it's going to happen kind of any time from now to the next 2 or 3 years, hopefully. Otherwise, it gets increasingly worse and worse and more damaging as that kind of goes on and that length increases. But I genuinely believe that salespeople, the sales profession, people who perhaps now are going into, well, I'm going to start my own business, I'm going to get some funding, I'm going to do this, this, and this, they're going to turn to jobs like sales, like marketing, and I think they're going to become hot again in the kind of like 5, 10 year period from now. It's something I genuinely believe in. With that, you've got one final thing that I want to kind of wrap up on. You piqued me interest with this. So with the sales school, one of the reasons I want to essentially drive a shit ton of revenue through it is because I want to do some legit scientific research on some of the misconceptions that exist within the sales industry. It takes, you may know kind of the behind the scenes of this, but it takes quite a lot of funding to be able to put any real data on this together. So you mentioned that there are some misconceptions and some research has come out over the past kind of decade, whatever it is, that has put some of these misconceptions to bed. What would be one or two of these misconceptions that perhaps salespeople have followed in the past that now, even though they might be following them now as well, but now we know aren't necessarily the best pathways to success?
So, couple. One is that as a species, we may not be as averse to change as people might suggest. It's how that change presents itself and so on. So, you know, most salespeople go into this notion that people are averse to change. And as a result of that, it drives their behavior, drives what they do, and it drives the opportunities that they miss because they're not willing to go down certain paths because they believe those paths are cut off to them by human nature. So if you change the human nature, you change the opportunities that become of that. Not to promote, but lately a lot of my thinking has been influenced by a book called Elastic, and they look about how they think and some of the changes. And if people are interested, that led to a video that I saw. It was a TED talk by Lara Boyd, and talking about how you can physically, structurally change the brain. So if you begin to think about how that knocks up against previous thought lines and the ability, if you can physically train the brain to do certain things, one of the things we do is sales, so think about the implications. But, I just don't have time to become a scientist. But as sort of a casual reader trying to apply it to day-to-day sales, and then there's a lot of things in that book that talk about how our minds are triggered and the implications of that for salespeople and things. So, the problem is that unless other people start reading these things in sales, I'm always going to be the odd voice out, and it's always going to come back to how many dials you have to make a day. But if people really want to change, we have to step back off this treadmill and saying, hey, we're going to run on that trainer's treadmill for a while because he's hip. And then next year we're going to run on Tibor's treadmill because he's hip. I think if people really want to talk about changing sales, and I think the time is right, because I think you're absolutely right, whether it's 2019 or 2020, this is the longest string we've had. And, it's everyone ends. This one is no different, just a question of when. And I think that's going to shake out the sales profession because all these people who are hanging on, companies are not going to want to support them. And they're either going to have to make a commitment to the profession, or they're going to have to find something else, which is all right. It's not a negative. Just because you didn't make it as a salesperson, you could still be a good dad and a contributing human being.
And the people who are crushing it are going to become even more valuable. The people who can generate their own leads, cold calling, emailing, knocking on doors, they're going to become even more valuable in a down marketplace where people are resilient to spend the cash because they've got their own operating costs to go after, right?
I'll throw a challenge out. To the sales leaders, I think that it's during that next downturn that if you really want to make a long-term difference, if you really want to build a resilient organization, think about what you do in the next downturn. Don't do what you did the last one, which is just reduce your sales staff, hold on to your buddies, the one you like most, the ones who you have beer with, who get the football pool right and all that. Really step back and say you're being given an opportunity. The market's giving you a reason to fire a whole bunch of people, right? So do it the right way for the right reason and map out where you want to be 3 years from now, not at the end of next quarter at your annual, directors meeting, board meeting, or whatever it is that you got to cover your ass in front of. If you want to be really revolutionary, think 3 years down the line and use the downturn as an opportunity, not as a reason to hide in your bunker.
Makes total sense. And with that, Tibor, I've got one final question for you. I've asked you this about 14 times now, and I can't remember the previous answers because I've asked you so many times. But if you could go back in time and speak to your younger self, what would be the one piece of advice you'd give him to help him become better at selling?
I would say learn how to play guitar so when the downturn comes, you can go on the road.
Well, that's one answer that we've not had before for sure.
I always go back to telling my younger self to be a bit more curious and to feel a bit more comfortable away from the crowd, which is, in essence, what we've been telling the people throughout the program today.
Makes total sense. With that, I appreciate your time, your insights on all this, Tibor. Tell us where we can find out more about you, and then any projects you want to share with the audience as well.
I made it really simple. You just go to myname.com. So it's Tibor Shanto, TiborShanto.com. Or if you really can't wait, you can reach me at +1 416 822 7781. And, no special projects, changing the universe one salesperson at a time, So slowly but surely we conquer the galaxy.
Well, with that, I will link to everything that we talked about, including the TED Talk, the couple of books as well, and of course your website and the phone number in the show notes to this episode over at salesman.red. And with that, Tibor, I want to thank you for your time, your expertise, and for helping us become more resilient in selling.
Always fun. Thank you, Will.